BioCentury this week is brought to you by Evotec. Evotec is a life science company pioneering drug discovery and development by integrating deep disease expertise, AI-driven innovation, and advanced technologies. Working across modalities, Evotec's fully integrated R&D value chain and flexible partnering models accelerate the journey from concept to cure. A key area of focus is cell therapy, where Evotec leverages cutting-edge iPSC technology, manufacturing know-how, and translational capabilities to deliver scalable, off-the-shelf solutions for complex diseases. From discovery through GMP production, Evotec supports the development of cell-based therapies, advancing regenerative medicine and bringing transformative treatments closer to patients.
It's been a tough year for cell and gene therapy, patient deaths, high-profile companies pulling out of the space, and sour investment sentiment. That said, we have seen some promising readouts in the clinic, and the field continues to mature, showing steady progress despite challenging market conditions. Joining me on the BioCentury This Week podcast to discuss the cell and gene therapy space is Bernd Mühlenweg. He's SVP Global Head of Business Development Cell Therapy at our sponsor, Evotec. Bernd is just back from the Cell and Gene meeting on the Mesa in Phoenix. And from the BioCentury side, we have my fellow executive editor, Selena Koch, and Lauren Martz, Executive Director of Biopharma Intelligence and Head of BioCentury's Product Development Analysis Team. I'm Jeff Cranmer, the host of the BioCentury This Week podcast. So let's dig in. Cell and gene therapy. Lauren, you follow the space closely. I'd like to turn to you to set the stage.
Thanks, Jeff. So here's how I would characterize the cell and gene therapy field this year. I think there have been some incredible scientific and efficacy-based advances. I think those are mixed in with some really devastating safety signals and possibly some difficult regulatory developments. So to get some of the negatives out of the way, AAV gene therapies face some major setbacks this year with several patient deaths. I think all of our minds go to the Sarepta studies of Elevidys in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, where we learned this year that 3 patients had died during clinical trials. There was also a patient death in Rocket Pharma's Danon disease gene therapy trial. And unfortunately, I think those patient deaths and any safety signals that we see sort of advance this decades-long narrative about whether or not gene therapies, AAV in particular, are safe enough to be used on the market and to be used broadly in patients with genetic diseases or eventually even more prevalent indications.
So I think our guest, Bernd, is going to come in with the optimistic view, despite all the bad news and companies telling us that it's a hard time to make the investment case. He sees where things are going. And in particular, I think he sees a lot of potential for ex vivo engineering of cell therapies for regenerative medicine applications. So that's a little different than the CAR Ts where they started.
All right, well, let's bring in Bernd right now. Bernd Mühlenweg is SVP Global Head of Business Development Cell Therapy at our sponsor, Evotec.
First of all, thank you for having me here today. So I think Selena is absolutely right. I'm looking more at the bright side and the positive perspectives, and that currently we really have bumpy times for cell and gene. That's without a question. And we see this from development events. We see this from investor sentiments. But overall, I think the long-term perspective at which we should be looking is really shows a great perspective. So currently we have more than 130 clinical trials in cell and gene ongoing. And as you rightfully said, Selena, the indications that started mainly driven towards oncology, they are driving more and more into indications with higher prevalence, AMD, Parkinson, and multiple sclerosis, and particular to mention type 1 diabetes, where we are also seeing the first clinical data coming out, including really functional immunosuppression now. So I think the market is existing, whereas the field is in its early days. So it will take time to get this really into a commercial attractive setup. And then in particularly on the long run, I truly believe that in the allogeneic space where you can work with cloaking technologies, so to shield the cells from immunosuppression, that's an approach that will, on the long run, revolutionize this field by allowing really tissue regenerative approaches with long-term durable engraftment of the cells. And I think this is really then the turning point also for many pharma companies, because it's the essentially only modality where you can have a tissue regeneration rather than only cure.
So you mentioned type 1 diabetes as an example of where the iPS cell-derived therapies have this maybe regenerative potential. Where else do you see this type of stem cell-based technology applying in the future?
So first of all, I think it's important to say, I think allogeneic has its place, but also autologous has its place. So although we are currently seeing there is a shift from the autologous cell therapies towards the allogeneic, I still believe that autologous will to play an important role into the future, because it has shown great promise and it has shown cure also for cancer patients, right? And there is no need or immediate need to generate a highly expensive allogeneic treatment if you have the autologous version available, in particular with the decentralized manufacturing. I think that's a good place for the autologous setting. But if you think along that therapies or tissue replacement may be required, for example, in ophthalmology, where you require photoreceptors be present for a long time. In diabetes, beta cells don't replicate so much, right? They are functional for a long, long time. And you think about persistence over 5 or even 10 years. That is something where for sure autologous approaches will not work, because the patients cannot suffer the immunosuppression over this long period of time. So I think all those indications where you are targeting a tissue regeneration or a functional regeneration, like in diabetes, they will on the long run be an allogeneic treatment available, because you can genetically engineer these treatments to prevent the rejection of the cells that you are providing to the patient.
So immune shielding these cell therapies obviously would be really useful, maybe to play the devil's advocate side of things. They also add engineering complexity to an already complex therapy, right? And so is that going to raise, regulatory scrutiny? Like, talk a little bit about what needs to happen there to kind of reduce that vision to reality.
No, absolutely. And that's a fair point, because I think there is no framework for discussions with the regulatory bodies, neither in the US nor in Europe, because these things don't exist yet, right? So I think it's really important, and I truly believe, also thinking about what I heard in Phoenix at the MESA meeting, that there is a kind of educational process between clinical trial sponsors as well as regulatory agencies to really understanding what is the impact on genetic engineering on the master cell bank, which you are ultimately using or generating only once for the treatment of all patients. So I think that's absolutely important. And the technical side, Selena, I think is also key, because it's barely impossible to compare this to a research setup where you can certainly run 3 or 4 genetic engineering steps in a row without impacting the results that you are getting in a research setting. I think as soon as we really go into development, the engineering step needs to be reduced to a minimum, ideally only one, so that your master cell bank that you are generating is really a fresh master cell bank. It hasn't seen too many passages, because as we know, every engineering step, every passage leads to mutations, which we ultimately need to avoid to have a genetically stable and integer master cell bank. But I think, again, this is a key concern. At the same time, the flip side is this is the key potential for this type of treatment. So, and there will need to be an educational process between the authorities and the first sponsors going into this direction with genetically engineered cells into the clinical development.
Well, what can we be expecting for this immune shielding cell therapy approach? Like, have there been clinical data already? Are there clinical data coming? What's the outlook there?
Sure. So indeed, there is clinical data available now that was published by Sana earlier this year in type 1 diabetes. And they showed, actually, it's a patient number is fairly limited with one patient at this moment in time, that they were able to generate cell shielding. This, however, was not the genetical engineering I've just spoken about. This has been using a lentiviral approach. But no matter what it is, I think this data is important for the whole sector in that regard, that it for the first time has shown that immune shielding of cells within a human is really feasible, right? And I think that's a milestone that we have to build on now to make a better engineering to get such a technological approach to be able to treat more patients in larger clinical trials.
Okay, and I wanted to get into sort of the in vivo side of cell therapies. You just mentioned lentiviruses. I know in some cases these are being used to create cell therapies inside patients. So, can you tell us about the status of that field and where the technology stands now?
Absolutely. I think it's currently certainly the next wave within cell and gene because many big pharma companies are currently making the bet here. And we have seen a couple of deals within this space. So that's certainly the next wave to come. And I mean, I think intellectually it's the right approach, right? You want to essentially make sure that you're succeeding to reprogram cells across the whole human body to overcome a certain disease. So the question will, in the end, in this therapeutic approach will be, do I get enough or sufficient virus load into the patient to succeed this reprogramming across the body? So I think it's a question of the amount of product that needs to be applied and the efficacy of the reprogram within the patient. So I think these are the two question marks in this area, and whether in terms of cost of goods, it is affordable in the end.
Cool. I'd like to turn to manufacturing and supply chain now, Bernd. Clearly, it's not as sexy as the other stuff that we've been talking about, but it's critical. Where do things stand?
So I'm coming from the meeting on the Mesa, which is quite a big cell and gene therapy conference. And I have to say, for the first time in my life at this kind of conference, I attended a supply chain panel and lecture, actually, which is very unique in this type of setup. So this already shows you how important this topic is. And there have also been patient advocates or even patients who explained how they perceived the treatment, what have been challenges. And one of the most impressive moments was a patient explaining, how much she suffered when she needed to understand that the supply chain wasn't delivering the material in time to hospital, so that she needed to postpone the treatment, that the whole thing's in her mind broke up, right? So I think this shows the importance of the supply chain post-manufacturing to have it all in place in a seamless way. And I think it's still very, very complex. I think where the industry is already good in shipping frozen products, because in the end, they are cold, they are frozen, and it's then a question of how do I thaw the product on site without losing quality of the product, number of cells, function of cells, etc. And I think this works already quite well because in the end, storage, labeling, traceability is a given. Questions will come up, and that's also then as part of the long-term development within cell therapy. How do I transport living cells? Because there are some type of cells which still cannot be frozen, and if I have to transport them living for immediate infusion into the site, that's another kind of game, I would say, that still needs to be tackled significantly. So overall, I think this is an area where, compared to other modalities, if you think like antibodies, small molecules, nobody is talking about this, right? So I think within cell and gene, this is certainly an area where we have to be cautious to make sure already during clinical development that we are establishing something meaningful that is able to handle in-time manufacturing coupled to a fully functional, traceable supply chain.
Sounds good. Well, maybe on the lighter side here, Bernd, you mentioned the meeting on the Mesa. I know you're a big biker, and at these meetings, you like to get out with a group of fellow biotechers and hit the road. How'd it go this time?
So indeed, the group is called Biotech Bikers. That's a group that tries to connect professionals across our industry to essentially build relationships while we are biking. So combining professional and private passion. And this time we went out actually the day before the Mesa meeting started on a Sunday for around about 85 kilometers ride directly into the desert. So I personally have to say I had never been before in the desert. So for me, it was a kind of really great event, and it is a great format to meet people and to connect on a different level, which is also good to continue a relationship in the future, because you always start with this: where did you bike last time, or what's happening next? So it's a good way to do this.
How can folks get connected with that group? I imagine you'll be doing it for the London Jeffries week, or maybe JPM.
So JPM is actually was the first ever biotech bikers ride back in 2018. Was founded by Mark Farmery, and so there's a website, biotechbikers.com, and you will also find Biotech Bikers Group on LinkedIn, which is the major instrument to connect all the people, also to announce the next rides, which are also done now not only next to conferences, but also locally in almost 20 local hubs in the meantime, spanning from Japan over Europe into the US.
Awesome. Well, I had a meeting with one prominent investor at last year's JPM, and she suggested that we do our meeting in 2026 either biking or drinking Manhattan. So I think I'm going to choose the latter.
I invite you to bike at
All right.
JP
Well,
Morgan.
maybe I'll see you there. So I'd like to get back to cell and gene therapy. Where are you seeing the investor perspective on the space now?
Yeah, I mean, we know that fundraising is very tough these days. And I mean, I'm not talking cell and gene here. We know that's the case, right? Lauren correctly opened this podcast by saying, there are many, many hurdles to overcome and many, many challenges we have been seeing in drug development. So it's certainly, cell and gene is certainly a very, very complicated place for investors at the moment because of all of these different findings. Also, if we think further on, reimbursement is certainly something that needs to be tackled, because there is a model of once in a lifetime treatment, ideally on the long run. And walking away from something to 2, 3, 400K per year treatment versus to going to a 1 million shot per lifetime is also complicated from a business model perspective. So there are also questions around this. And as we all know, investors very well, they are taking this into account also for early type of investments. So I think there is quite a piece of skepticism for investors to make massive shots on goal in this space. Although it's also fair to see that we have been seeing quite some big investment rounds for the more mature companies during the course of this year, already going into the more than 100 million. So my feeling is it's very, very closely observed, but still in a waiting position with very selected investments being done.
What could trigger a change in that? Is there anything coming up in terms of
I think,
launches
yeah.
or regulatory decisions? Yeah.
Yeah. Look at Blue Rock at the moment. They went with their Parkinson's disease treatment from a phase 1 study now right away into a phase 3 study. So, and if this is successful, they will be proving that you can approve a cell therapy product in a large indication with less than 400 patients treated. So I think if you look at companies like Blue Rock, which is now jumping into a phase 3 development for Parkinson's disease, and if in case they are successful in this indication, they will have treated less than 400 patients to come to approval. So should this be successful, I think these are the cornerstones that really show that cell therapy can be developed in a meaningful time frame with meaningful cost and be approved in large therapeutic indications. So I think this essentially is what investor interest will finally trigger, and will also allow to better balance the risk in earlier stage companies, because until these days, although we have certainly, I don't know the latest numbers, about 50 products approved in cell and gene at the moment, only 6 already this year. Still, if you compare this to how many approvals do we have with small molecules or an antibody per year, the sheer number is still less than this, right? So I think building on a good scientific basis, also building up the sheer number of attempts that have been developed to drive a better statistical understanding of what's the risk of these therapeutic approaches, that's something that will trigger the investor interest.
Okay, well, Bernd, this has been really awesome. Totally enjoying your insights here. If you had to give a quick parting thought, what would you say about cell and gene therapy in this moment?
Well, you are asking the one who is convinced, right? So I
Yes.
think this is
Excellent.
this is the next modality that will change the treatment paradigm across many indications, most likely even more than antibodies did in the past.
Well, when you say that, because this is a big space with a lot of variety inside it, right? Are you thinking mostly of the sort of regenerative cell therapy side of things, or are you thinking of,
Exactly. I think
yeah,
this is really it. So currently we are using cell and gene really to mainly, to put it a little bit in black and white, mainly to treat oncology indications, right? Where you want to disrupt the tumor microenvironment, you want to make the tumor visible for the immune system, you want to give it a short-term treatment in it that really changes the biological setup. And that's working quite well. However, if you think about the future, this goes into really regenerative approaches to have a diabetic patient who doesn't require further medication because he had received an islet transplant. That's something really mind-blowing, and that's really changing the treatment paradigms we have these days, which is really providing cure and not only treatment.
All right. Sounds good, Bernd. You have been listening to the BioCentury This Week podcast with our special guest, Bernd Mühlenweg, SVP, Global Head of Business Development, Cell Therapy, and biking enthusiast. Bernd, thank you for joining us
Thank you for
on the
having me.
podcast.
Thank you so much.
Well, that was some good stuff there, Selena and Lauren. What stood out to you, Selena?
well, it's visionary, right? It's very forward-looking to a future where finally true regenerative medicine, tissue regeneration could be possible. So it's fun to imagine that space and that future. It's really interesting the way he phrased it as that's the next big modality. Because if that were true, it would kind of leapfrog a lot of things happening that have been happening and are happening right now. You know, AAV-based gene delivery, things like that. What do you think, Lauren?
I think it's a really interesting idea and really exciting if that does prove to be true. And I think that what we've seen with the sauna data in particular, the fact that you could, create these iPSC-derived cells that do seem to be hypoimmune based on this data that we have from one patient, it really does open up a lot of possibilities. So right now we've seen this, in the patient with type 1 diabetes. We've seen some exciting potential in this phase 1 trial for Parkinson's disease. So you can just sort of imagine all the possibilities that if you can make these regenerative medicine cell therapies that really do evade the immune response in the way that we're hoping, once the genetic technologies are in place to do the types of things that we've seen so far, yeah, I think it's something that could be transformational.
Excellent. Well, if you like what you've been listening to, like and subscribe the BioCentury This Week podcast. A special thanks to Bernd for joining us today and to Evotec for sponsoring us. And as ever, Kendall Square Orchestra, which provides the music for BioCentury's podcasts. We'll be back on Monday with the next episode of the BioCentury This Week podcast. I'll be away, but Stephen Hansen will be hosting from the UK, so you'll be in very good hands. Catch you next week.
BioCentury would like to thank Evotec for supporting the BioCentury This Week podcast. To learn more about how Evotec can support your goals through pioneering drug discovery and development solutions, go to evotec.com/innovation.